Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesday. This week we are joined by my friend Carie, who is a passionate advocate and a scholar with a master's degree in Franciscan Theology. Her studies are centered on child liberation theology and spiritual environmentalism, exploring how these principles intersect with today's challenges. She lives on a tranquil half-acre nestled in the forest of Central Florida with her husband, Zach, and their 2 young children. And Carie embraces a lifestyle rooted in sustainable living and self-directed education. Their homestead serves as a canvas for cultivating native plants, growing food, and nurturing a deep connection to the natural world. With her expertise in Franciscan theology and commitment to holistic education, Carie brings unique insights into navigating spiritual growth, environmental stewardship, and the Franciscan approach to spiritual interpretation. I cannot wait for you to hear this conversation. So without any further ado, let's begin. Hey, everybody. We are here with Miss Carie Moore, and I am so grateful for her time and her expertise. And can you just take a moment to introduce yourself, share whatever you'd like about your expertise in this Franciscan theology that we're going to be talking about? I think it's pretty profound in its understanding of spirituality. I'm so excited, and there's other folks in the deconstruction space that are excited for this conversation. And so where did you first learn of it?
I first learned about Franciscan theology actually in undergrad. I was a religion and philosophy major in undergrad. And I had a professor who was actually a former Franciscan priest and monk. And I don't think, have ever been introduced to Franciscan theology if it wasn't for him. I had never heard of it before. It all kind of, when he was teaching the class and stuff, it kind of blew my mind. Definitely sent me into a little bit of a faith crisis too, as well, because it challenges you so much to rethink things from the way they're often portrayed in mainstream Christianity. And so eventually while it also challenged me, I also ended up falling in love with it. And so after that, I pursued a master's in Franciscan theology. And that's where I am now. So just kind of working in that field.
So how long is that? About 6 years of school, you said?
Yeah, about 6. Yeah.
Yeah. And does that involve lots of papers and answering questions? And what does that actually look like?
Oh, yes. So both for my bachelor's and my master's, it was very writing intensive.
Mm-hmm.
So I was writing essays all the time, and my master's kind of culminated in this 60 to 70 page thesis that we have to write.
Wow. Yeah. So I'm definitely I've always thought about maybe going back to school. So I'm always like, ooh, tell me more. So I have I look up to that, lots of respect for that. I feel like some folks maybe don't really wrap their brain around how much goes into that sort of work. And It always is due respect, regardless of where we fall on the belief spectrum. How do you feel or believe that these Franciscan principles can guide individuals? Like you said, it hits you as a faith crisis, like, whoa, because I've been speaking out about some of the more guilt and fear-oriented aspects of maybe this traditional Christian gospel message. And that's definitely not the vibe here. And so how do their principles help us in navigating spiritual growth and the challenges that we see right now in today's world?
So for me, I guess, I'll kind of start at the beginning here. When I was 18 and went into undergrad, I was kind of coming from the mindset of being a super church kid. Like I was the kind that it wasn't just my mom making me go to church. I wanted to go to church. And I read lots of books about religion. Like I was the teenager that, instead of reading like a fiction book, I was picking up all the Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ and things like that. So I went into college thinking this is going to be nothing. I'm going to be super experienced with this. It's going to be challenging, but also I'm used to this. And I was quickly shown that I don't actually know nearly as much as I thought I knew. And that's not necessarily about there's so many more facts to know. It was about seeing how the certainty that I had about so many things was not kind of the vibe in a college classroom. It was very much more asking questions and sometimes not even coming up with answers. And then me being totally baffled that the professor is okay with this, is okay with not having answers, and for saying, well, it could be this or this. I had sort of come from a mindset of, well, everything's sort of got an answer, and I knew you couldn't know everything about God. And then that sort of plunged me into wow, there's so many questions I had not thought about. And the first time you start trying to sit with uncertainty, I don't know if you experienced this, it can be extremely uncomfortable. And so I'm very thankful that I was introduced, that I had the opportunity to be introduced to Franciscan theology, because I have told my husband this, that like, I don't even know if I would still be Christian right now, because the questions were just too much. And so Franciscan theology really helps you, it encourages leaning into the mystery of Christ, and the reality that our faith revolves around mystery. I mean, the incarnation, creation, the resurrection. We cannot fully understand God, but we can lean into curiosity. And so that's where it really helped me to sort of give me the grace and like kind of the permission to not know.
Yes. And that is probably the most difficult aspect of deconstructing for a lot of us, is to go from the solid ground that this certainty we perceive gives us, and then trying to walk on water. For,
Yes.
Lack of a better words. It's like a lot less stable. And that's where I started really looking at how I was thinking just black and white in regards to, or I had, gone to eating disorder therapy, and I was like, oh, that was black and white. Or I was in an MLM, which was also very black and white. And I was just starting to see how a lot of my life I had been kind of gravitate. Oh, and I was like, oh, wait, this is just kind of a human brain thing. We tend to, so I found compassion there for all of us struggling in this like black and white aspect. And we see that if you leave one high control group, it's very common to find yourself in another one just with similar ideologies with a different kind of face on it. So it's something to really be aware of. So I've heard somewhere there's 3 categories of what you know. What you know, what you know, you don't know, and what you don't know, you don't know. And that category gets bigger and bigger the more we study. And so I definitely can agree with you on that, or agree or relate to your experience with kind of, it's great to be confident and then also have this sort of intellectual humility. And that comes along with letting go of certainty, correct?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And I feel like that is so important. I think it makes me, when I started reading the history of Christian theology in December, I think that's actually what started kicking off my deconstruction, because I just saw how the great division between the East and the West, and how I understood why they hashed out certainty to be able to and what is the Trinity and what is it not? And they were really trying to I understand the point, right? But they really excluded everyone else that didn't agree with that one hard definition. And that's been happening for a long time. I feel like this is going back to the root of really the very beginning, because so many of the things, like the list of what you have to confess to believe to be an Orthodox Christian, has gotten quite long since the 19th century. And so I just really appreciate where you guys are at. Well, something we really connected on in the very beginning of our chatting in the DMs was this love for nature, and also connecting that with chronic health, because I've been on one heck of a chronic health journey for the last 4 years. It's been really humbling, especially very good for me in my diet and nutrition and fitness coaching world. It's helped me be just a much better coach, right? So we can always learn from our struggles. And so Franciscan theology emphasizes the goodness of creation, viewing the natural world as a reflection of God's beauty and goodness. And I feel like everyone can relate to that, whether everyone on any belief spectrum. When you look out into nature, we just feel this immense gratitude, whether it's a little tiny flower or a big mountainscape,
Oh,
so how do you see this theological perspective connecting to practices like gardening and growing our own food, and supporting our body's health journeys?
Well, this has actually been a huge thing in my life. So I'll just say right off the bat, I've been really enjoying your gardening stories. I've been kind of living vicariously through you, because I've actually kind of been having some health problems since January. Went to a bunch of doctors and nobody could figure out what was going on. Turns out I just have severe anemia. So I'm kind of on the way up, but I haven't had the energy or the capability of having a garden this spring. So I've been loving your garden. the fact that I would consider myself a gardener by hobby, of course, and very amateur. I mean, I'm still learning is quite, it's quite the plot twist in my life because I don't know if you know, but I live in Florida. And the two things that I detest most of all are the two things that I'm surrounded by all the time, and that's heat and bugs. And so I grew up not like my mom liked to garden and I hated it. I remember telling her one time, when I'm an adult, I'm going to hire somebody to do all of my yard work because I'm not going to be doing any of it. So that's kind of the backdrop of where I am. My family really can't believe that now I've gotten so into gardening, and I still do live in Florida, which I swore I never would. But once I started learning more about St. Francis and his love for creation and how he saw how his understanding of creation really fueled the way he lived kind of in community with the created world and his service to the created world, it naturally brought me to a point where I started to genuinely want to connect with nature and with the world. And I wanted to live more sustainably. And I wanted to garden and grow my own food and see the beauty in nature. And St. Francis, he had started out as he was kind of a party animal. He grew up in a really rich merchant family in Italy. He was super privileged. And he underwent this kind of, at one point in his life, this conversion where he realized this doesn't actually reflect how I want to be living. And so he gave up all his wealth, even the clothes off of his back, he gave back to his father because he said, I want none of this. He wanted to live in solidarity with creation and with the poor. And there's one story where he meets a leper for the first time. And he writes about that what had once seemed bitter to him had turned into sweetness of body and soul. And that's kind of how I feel that Franciscan theology of the earth has led me. Something that was once very bitter to me has now become something that I genuinely love, not because I'm more okay with the heat and the bugs, although seeing the goodness in the bugs, which St. Francis did too. I mean, there's a story of him helping a worm cross the street. So like he truly saw the beauty and the goodness in each individual aspect of creation. It hasn't helped me to feel more comfortable, but it has helped me to have a genuine desire to care for and nurture even just the little bit of creation that I'm living on right now and to do what I can.
Yeah, I love that. And I can relate in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm very much an amateur gardener. I have a lot of houseplants and I've kind of been rocking that since probably 2019. And now because being in the military, we do move a lot. So this is the first house that we don't have to move for 3 years and we own it so we can like put it in the ground. And yeah, so I'm still learning a lot, and my garden just got really hit hard. If you saw, all the squash plants are gone. That's all 6, and that's really gutting because I just gave a ton away thinking I was gonna have an abundance, and now I'm like, so like take it. We'll have a lot. Never mind. Mm-hmm. So just the understanding of like taking something that was once bitter, and then it doesn't mean it changes it completely, but just helping see all different sides of it. It just seems like that's also this theme of this conversation too, is just taking it from that black and white or that stinking thinking. And in here in Virginia, and I'm also right by a swamp. I'm also right by, Jamestown, Williamsburg. So we're right by the water and Yorktown. Mm-hmm. So it's very hot. It's very humid. It's very buggy. And we were also living in Japan at one point, which is also insanely humid and hot. Like 100%, it's monsoon season. And I struggled. Like, you can ask my husband if you ever get to chat with him. I would be like, yeah, no, I'm not going to be out there. He's like, I'm native. The mosquitoes don't bite me. He always says that. And I guess that's his truth. It's not my truth. And so I hear you. I'm thinking about getting some sort of crazy, wicked, crazy suit to wear, like all sorts of like screen and be like, you can't get me. And I'm going to be out here weeding. So yeah, it's definitely tough. One, let me know. Yeah. I will. I've been really considering it because it's not, I come inside and I'm like, I'm really proud of myself that I was out there for this long, but maybe I should have come in a little sooner. So we'll shift gears because this is some stuff that I'm really excited to pick your brain about. Been talking a little bit about original sin and I mentioned fear and guilt around some of this traditional gospel message. And so I'd love to touch on this Franciscan view that contrasts original sin with original goodness, which kind of ties into what we were just talking about: goodness of nature, goodness of bugs, goodness of mosquitoes, goodness of it all, which raises intriguing questions of human action and God's creation. So please, can you dive more into this?
Yes. So the mainstream understanding of sin, especially in the West, among, I would say, most Christian denominations, is that when Adam and Eve sinned, when the first humans sinned, they altered the core of who human beings are, like kind of the nature that now from that time on, every human being is born with a sin nature. Everything in creation is now tainted with this evil sin nature. And that Jesus, of course, can be redemptive of that and can renew us, but that without Jesus, we're all at our core fundamentally bad. And I mean, I know that you have pointed it out, and so many other people have pointed out how this can be really harmful, of course, because I mean, you're someone's, whether it's their theology or just their belief system in general, it really influences how they act in relation to others or even in relation to the earth. If you believe that the only value for the earth is that it serves us, then you're going to be more likely to exploit it for human benefit. If you believe that people are fundamentally bad, like for example, you see this a lot in, like Christian biblical parenting. If you believe that your child is born with a sin nature, you're much more likely in the face of perceived misbehavior to be in a punitive mindset that I need to punish you because your sin nature is coming out. You're being bad. And the Franciscan tradition doesn't really prescribe to those beliefs. So in that way, it very much sort of shifts from this mainstream idea about sin. And that's not to say that Franciscans don't believe in sin. Of course, sin exists because it's a deviation. Sin is a deviation from love. Anything that deviates from love, the nature, the love of God from which we were created, anything that deviates from that, hatred or violence and exclusion, things like that is sin. But the difference is that Franciscan theology does not claim that that is our fundamental nature, because when you think about that, it really gives humans way too much power. You have to ask, can human action fundamentally alter what God has already declared good? Because God has the freedom to create. I mean, nothing can exist outside of God's desire and love for that thing to exist. And so God's not going to create bad things. God declared that everything was very good. And so how can a temporary human action have that much power and that much influence that it fundamentally alters the nature of what God has already created? And I think that's really where the Franciscan theology of original goodness comes from. And then you see how this affects further theology and further action within the Franciscan tradition, because then a lot of in the Franciscan tradition, social justice, environmental justice, outreach, solidarity, it's all emphasized so much, where if you see, and I'm not trying to generalize here, but a lot of denominations who really focus on original sin, what's much more emphasized than outreach to others and care for others is sort of this idea of trying to convince others that they need Jesus and they have to turn away from their sin. And it's all more of a cognitive thing that you have to believe, and it doesn't really impact how they love others quite as much. And again, that's a huge generalization, but it is the experience of a lot of people. And so that's why reimagining how our anthropology, whether it's positive or negative, is going to influence how we act and live in the world.
That was, very beautifully and well articulated. I was looking for a quote that I shared the other day. There are 5 gospels. And you're like, wait, what? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Christian. Most people will never read the first 4.
Yes.
And, that was really powerful to think about, right? Because I talked a lot about, the gap between your orthodoxy and your orthopraxy. So like what you understand to be know to be true, but then what you do might be wrong. And so, of course, we see this struggle, whether you're a Christian or not, you'll see this. And I feel like, theology itself is lots about God, and it's always evolving and changing. And that's what should be exciting and not so rigid. And that's kind of what we're saying here is like, hey, can we challenge some of this theology that really doesn't shake out to make sense? It also doesn't shake out to be fruitful. So if we want to do this almighty fruit test, then there's several of these orthodox beliefs, like especially the womanhood submission aspect as well, is not really fruitful. Another one that we could challenge and also isn't true in the history of the church, which is, I think, first and foremost. And so the other thing that we can talk here is this Franciscan theology and tradition emphasizes this incarnation of Jesus is a central and free will choice of God. So free choice, not merely as a response to human sin. And this kind of goes along with original sin, because so many folks, they can't wrap their brain around, well, why Jesus have to die? And I'm like, well, did you know that there's other atonement theories? It's kind of what I've asked. Like, I did not. And that was one of the things I got so mad about from, I guess, the Reformed community, is they walk around with this biblical truth and how dare you? Like, just how dare you say such things? It's really prideful, it feels.
Yeah.
So this raises an interesting question. If humans had not sinned, do you believe God would have still chosen to become human?
I definitely do, because so this was actually, again, another question that I was asked in undergrad when I was sort of in this whirlwind of like, what is going on here? My professor actually asked that question. And my initial answer was like, no, Jesus came to die on the cross for sins. So Jesus would not. And that was like pretty much the answer of the whole class. And I think he blew everybody's minds when he said, so does that mean sin is a good thing? Because God's central act of love would not have happened if it wasn't for sin. So should we be thankful for sin? And I was like, oh my gosh, like, why do you do this to me every time I come into this class? So you said that you didn't know about other atonement theories. I did not realize, I went most of my life not realizing, one, that the idea that Jesus died on the cross to pay a sin debt was actually considered a theory to begin with, not like it's like both somehow doctrine and theory, but it is a theory.
Yes.
Yes. And also that there were others. So the theory of substitutionary atonement, with the idea that Jesus died on the cross to pay a sin debt, which is kind of how most of the Western Church frames the crucifixion. That theory actually wasn't developed till the 10th century, so 1,000 years after Jesus died, which means that for most of Christian history, because it hasn't quite been that long since the theory was developed, so for most of Christian history, this was not the primary doctrine, the primary idea of why Jesus died. And so you have 1,000 years of church history where there are other atonement theories going around. Like there are various ways to understand why Jesus died. And again, that's something that when I heard it, I was like, wow, why don't more people know this? It seems like we should have the option, but again, then that's the high control thing. If we have more options of what to believe, then it can't be controlled what we believe and how we act and things like that. So basically, Anselm of Canterbury in the 10th century, he developed this idea. It's in his work, Cur Deus Homo, which means why did Jesus become human? And so he throughout this big document, he kind of answers the question by saying, well, God is fully just. And so because of that, God can't just forgive. There has to be justice. There has to be some sort of transaction. And so Jesus died to kind of be the payment for our sins. And a very important thing about that is we have to understand that Anselm was writing in the context of his own time and culture, where medieval lords, they couldn't just forgive the debt or of I forgot what is it, the people who worked for them. I forgot what the name is, but they could not just forgive the debt. And so there had to be some sort of payment. And so because he's seeing it, just like we all do, we all have our own worldview and we kind of judge things based on what we know. He saw that. And so it made sense for him to look at atonement in this way. And Franciscan theology shifts from that, in that there's a focus on the incarnation, that Jesus became human simply out of God's desire to be one with creation. It's all based in love and not a transaction for sin. That God, I think there's a quote by Franciscan Father Richard Rohr. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm pretty sure it goes something like, Jesus didn't become human to change God's mind about us. Jesus became human to change our mind about God. So we had all of these, throughout history, we had these beliefs that God required, so many things in order to be right with God. And then God throws all of that upside down by saying, no, I'm going to be here with you, and I'm going to go through all of this with you. There's nothing that you could do to earn this from me. I'm going to be here with you, even if it means going through childhood, that it goes through all the implications of childhood and the struggles of that, and living in poverty, and ultimately being crucified, being oppressed himself. And in that way, the incarnation shows God's ultimate solidarity with all who are oppressed, with all who suffer. And it wasn't a suffering it wasn't a transaction of suffering for us. It was suffering with us. And so it still can renew us. It's not that, oh, well, then it doesn't matter if it doesn't get us to heaven. It reminds us that Jesus' entire life up to the incarnation was not some sort of like side note on the way to eternity. It reminds us that Christianity isn't just a path to the afterlife, that it should and can transform us in the here and now in how we interact and live in the world. And so Jesus's death was a natural consequence of the life he was living. He was standing up to the empire. He was challenging the status quo. And that made a lot of people mad. And so he was crucified. And then his resurrection shows God's ultimate power over death and over, the hatred of the world.
Very well articulated. And I think what I've been really trying to wrap my brain around is, when they try to say that this debt was paid through Jesus's death, that is not actually true, because the debt was then canceled because then he was resurrected. So it's like, okay, well, if you're trying to say that it's like this equal justice thing, then you can't have both.
Exactly.
It doesn't make any sense. And that's like a lot of my issues. I've been talking about the spiritual hamster wheel. I'm like how much stuff I threw away when the Reformed folks got a hold of me, and how much they like just took away the rest of my spiritual journey and just like said everything was demonic and everything was wrong. And just, wow, it's just been so hard coming out of that. I was 37 years old when I was converted into this like really high control version, and how much that they took from me. And now I'm like slowly getting that back, but I can never be who I was. And that's fine, because none of us can be. And so, Chat GPT and I are best friends. I don't know if you know that. I literally like thank it, and it's like, you're welcome, Megan. So during Anselm's time, because I asked really quickly, because I was just curious, like we were talking about Anselm, and I learned a lot about Anselm and the book I mentioned, and I talked about it a lot in season 1, Roger E. Olson, and he's one of my favorite theologians, and he did a great job mapping out kind of Christian theology, and he represented him, I thought, very fairly. So he was alive, or this during his time would be the 11th and 12th centuries. And so there were several religions that were talking about this concept of divine justice. So I just wanted to talk a little bit like who was influencing him? What was that, right? Like we might talk about this context, but let's put a little more to that. So Islam was emphasizing divine justice. We have Judaism, which explored divine justice in the rabbinic, and please forgive me if I mispronounce big words, literature, and focusing on God's justice within this relational covenant with the Jewish people. Eastern Christianity had specific theologians like Dr. John of Damascus, which emphasized the God's righteousness and justice in relation to human sin and salvation. We have Zoroastrianism, I have no idea, highlighted truth, order, and justice in a cosmic struggle between good and evil. Hinduism and Buddhism also focus on like karmic justice or divine justice through karmic action and dharma. And so that's kind of neat to look at it like that way. Be like, okay, interesting. Regardless of where we fall in these belief spectrums, humans are trying to grapple with this concept of divine justice. What do we do when things aren't being handled here on earth? Sometimes we find comfort knowing that there's someone out there that'll rule, or it makes so much sense. You can find so much compassion for folks who might fall into these beliefs, but truthfully, it doesn't really also make sense, like compared to how you just explained it prior. And like, why would God become human, and that sort of reflection of that. So pretty cool to have your mind blown and then find such a more wholesome, it feels just more warm and loving of a path to walk of spirituality. And that's kind of the name of the game, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
And that's
definitely.
probably what Jesus's name of the game was too. He's like, yo, I mean, it seems like he was calling out a lot of legalism and a lot of stuff like that. So,
Oh, yeah.
um, so Saint Francis urged us to walk in the footsteps of Christ. And so our theology will shape how we approach this journey. So we were just talking about the orthopraxy, which was what you do because of what you know. And so how does Franciscan theology influence our path in following Christ and our interactions with both fellow humans in the natural world? So we talked a little bit about like social justice, so put a little bit more specifics to that. Like maybe in the history, if you can come up with any examples of what that would look like, or right now, like, because some of us, are barely getting by ourselves. Like, there's the gap of financial, like we're struggling. And so how can we help others while we're also trying to buy groceries? It's a lot going on.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think that um that as far as social justice goes, there's often this idea that you have to do big things in order to make a difference. And a lot of times those responsibilities kind of in a social way almost seem to fall on the shoulders of the people who are, like celebrities and people with lots of influence somehow get away with not doing much. And then it's the kind of, I guess, I don't know any other way to say it, but the regular people who sort of feel like there's so much that they want to do. And I think it's important to remember that social justice can also include like just your own sphere of influence. It doesn't have to you don't have to feel bad if, you can't donate hundreds of dollars to charity. Like we're still the kind of family that's like living paycheck to paycheck. And like so many people, um, you know, we start to feel bad that we can't do more. But for me, I've had to remind myself that even social justice can be in the way that I treat my own family. Like having sort of this culture in our own family of love and acceptance and of action when we can for the people in our community and whatever we can do, even if that's limited. And I can follow in the footsteps of Christ by showing love to my own children. And so that's a lot. There's so many different ways I think that we can follow in Christ's footsteps, and that's where we have to get creative. Is it doesn't always mean doing exactly, I mean, we can't go live the exact life Jesus lived, right? But we have to ask ourselves,
how can the gospel influence my life and the way that I live with those I'm surrounded with, in the way that I treat my family, the way that I treat my community, the way that I address oppression in the world, the way I stand in solidarity with the suffering of the world? The gospel has the opportunity to truly be transformative in those ways.
How is that going to shape and inform my actions? And so that's one reason why I focus on my page on parenting and rethinking kind of how do we view sort of this idea of Christian parenting, because it's so often Christian parenting is oppressive parenting to children. And so then my one aspect of the way that I try to follow in the footsteps of Christ is to try to treat my children with the love and respect that Christ modeled to us. And I think that that's where we have to get creative of, okay, so how can I apply what Jesus taught us to a modern situation that really doesn't look anything like where Jesus lived, or really look anything like the environment and the things that were going on back then, So we have to see where we can show that love to others, or like you said, even in your gardening, that caring for the earth, caring for creation, any way that we can be love, because ultimately that's the purpose for which we were created, to be ourselves and to live freely in the love of God. And in Franciscan theology, there's this idea that God's love is self-diffusive, that true love cannot be contained and that it will always naturally flow out of us. And so we're empowered by the idea and by the knowledge that we exist in love, and then we can freely love others instead of kind of feeling this rigid that we have to control or we have to judge. We can love now without the fine print, So anyway.
But, I feel like when we're all in this container of living on planet Earth, trying to reflect on our thoughts on God, when we really don't know certainty, we don't have the original manuscripts, we don't really know actually Jesus's real words. We really don't. But I feel like you're hitting it on the head much more than anybody else, because this feels like the actual message that he was working with in his time. And I think one of the biggest issues I have, because I've been kind of pushing back on the gospel message and how the fatalistic mindset that can come out of this, like God's will must foster this sense of like, I feel like this resignation that people just give in. And a lot of the Reformed theology, when it's this monergism versus synergism of like your sanctification and your walk on this earth, or that's been the biggest, I thought, psyop is like, if you just resign and say like, well, God's got it. Or when that comes to even just the justice of the abuse and the predators in the church, I'm like, no, like this is right now. And that's like, I think really neat is what you were, the whole point of this conversation is, to be the footsteps, to be the arms and hands of Christ. And that can be how you help a worm cross the street. I am struggling to kill the Japanese beetles on my friggin' hardy hibiscus out there. You have to crunch them really hard. And Patrick's like, he just thinks it's so cute. He's like, you can't even kill a bug. I'm getting better at killing the little caterpillars that are all over it. And he's like, I'm really proud of you. It's just like really hard. It's just genuinely hard. And like, we had 18 chickens. Now we have 6. So that's been traumatic. And I've yelled at him. I'm like, you need to walk the property and find this before me. Cause he's always at work. And then I find it and the dogs do or something. So yeah, it's been really difficult. Farming's really, really hard. And I grew up on lots of property here in Virginia my whole life. We've had a lot of animal deaths, and it's just been, trying to help a turtle get across the street. And then you're like, oh my gosh, please don't run it over. It's like, you're going to puke. Like, I feel like a lot of humans can really relate to loving animals and loving nature, and then finding some sort of way to like connect that in their spirituality in some way, shape, or form. And like when we go out to the grocery store, how you interact with the folks that bag your groceries, how you interact with someone that you're getting the cart from, how you interact when you're in your car, there's so many elements that you can show up in this way to do what we were just saying is what's a form of social justice that doesn't cost money, and your ripple effect with how you treat your kids and how you raise them and how they treat their friends at school and how they treat their teachers and how they treat their school bus drivers, or they're maybe not public school, but the whole point is a ripple impact happens. And that's really the empowerment aspect is like, there's so many things that are outside of our control. And that's where I get monergism, or that's where I get that sense of fatalism is like, you're right. There's a lot of things that we can't control. And that's actually important to address, or you will go cray trying to like just freak out, because especially with the knowledge of social media expands all the tragedies all over the world. And we're just much more aware than we have ever been before. I don't know if that's good for us. And if there is a God, then he's the only one who's emotionally mature to handle all that, not us. And so we need to slow down over that. But, some other ideas, thank you, ChatGPT, that we can do to volunteer our time, or like, how can we be impactful without money is, volunteering our time, which some of us don't have a lot of time. Some of us do. So, local organizations or shelters or community centers, you could tutor, you could, organize events. Sharing your skills is something my husband and I are really, really passionate about. I'm going to organize free hula hooping classes. He, teaches bonsai skills online. He has people over here. He wants to help veterans work with their PTSD and anxiety with tree care and this like nerding out on trees. So sharing your skills, guys, language lessons, computer skills, I think that's really incredible. We can boost each other up and really learn how talented we all are. That involves organizing community events or attending one, finding a community garden. Most places have those. So if you don't have a plot of land, maybe you can find one nearby. Also, food stamps. Some cities take food stamps for starter plants or for seeds. So you can even do a little bit of gardening with some of your food stamp money if you can fit that in. But just advocating for change like you and I do on our Instagram, that actually is a form of social justice. But we can do something like, with council meetings or community boards, or looking for local advocacy groups to see if we can get a little bit more on the ground for like public safety, and a couple other more like supporting local businesses. like just finding a local butcher that you like, and maybe you can only go there once a month because it's a 45-minute drive. Or I don't know what that looks like in y'all's town, but for us, we try to find like local restaurants that do from scratch, that source produce from local places. And we love that. It's not very cheap, so we don't go very often, but we try to just do what we can in those regards to foster these community connections and just raise awareness wherever we can. So I hope that some of those ideas resonated with some of the listeners here, to know that it doesn't cost money to do social justice. You don't have to make big, huge, massive ripples. It can be little tiny things. And that's really, I feel like, part of this message of resting in Christ would be, not thinking you have to take on what he already has. Right?
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so we're really coming up on the hour. I wanted to say in my research, would you say, do you have a name for this atonement theory that Franciscan theology like lies under? Or is it moral influence theory? Because that's something I read in my research. And I was like, oh, this kind of sounds like it, but is it not?
So I actually haven't heard of a specific name, because I know that there's like the Christus Victor, there's different atonement theologies. I would say what it is, to me, what it relates the most to, at least in my experience, this might not be totally true for every Franciscan, but it seems to relate to me mostly to liberation theologies of, so that the cross, it essentially, Jesus, it was an act of solidarity with the suffering, with the oppressed, and through Jesus, God is ultimately identified with all the oppressed in the world. And that is what, to me, seems most similar to the Franciscan take, are different like liberation theologies that have been developed.
Yeah. So moral influence theory, instead of focusing, like we were saying, this penal substitutionary atonement theory, well, that's more of the reformers one, or just this like justice must be satisfied, was developed by Anselm. And then the reformers built on that. The moral influence theory emphasizes transformation through the example of Jesus's selfless love and sacrifice. So it feels similar. It might not be the exact same. And it promotes spiritual growth without relying on fear, guilt, or coercion, encouraging individuals to respond to God's love with their own acts of love and service. So I felt like it may not be exactly, but that's what theology is. We're just throwing around thoughts and concepts. And I was like, wow, that feels close to kind of what we've been talking about. And that feels so much more loving. If we're coming up with concepts of God and we want to say that he's all loving, this feels, like I said earlier, like the nail on the head.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, everything you just said, it fits. So
is there anything else you'd want to add here, like as we're closing up, that I didn't ask you, or you want to, throw out there while we got a little bit more of your time?
Just one thing I was thinking of, especially just to kind of add on to the atonement theories, is, again, we were talking about how our orthodoxy influences our orthopraxy, like our beliefs will influence our practices, and just kind of addressing how these atonement theories have shifted the focus of what Christianity is actually focused on. So when you take like substitutionary atonement theory, where that only applies if you believe in Jesus, the entire focus of Christianity becomes one of convincing more people to believe in Jesus, right? Because if you think they're going to suffer for all of eternity, well, of course, you're going to try to convince so many people that they need to believe in Jesus. So then that becomes the focus. And then everything else kind of gets pushed as sort of a secondary, like, right, we have to love people. We have to live like Jesus did. We have to do all these things. But really, mostly, we can skirt around that because what we got to do is keep people from hell. And so I think that is another area where that atonement theory can be harmful, and we're rethinking it, where it doesn't have to be a transaction, and it's not based in sort of this cognitive, like what you believe, because really, if you think about it, that's kind of a faux grace. Like it's framed as grace, but really you still have to, it's still an action you have to take. I mean, you still have to believe, and depending on which community you're part of, the list gets longer of what you have to believe to receive salvation. When really, wouldn't true grace and true mercy just just be fully accepting and forgiving without needing even the transaction first, much less the belief. And so then once you kind of free yourself up from this idea of, having to be an evangelist and an apologist, you can actually focus. I think that frees up time to focus on walking in the footsteps of Christ, which I think is where we see a lot of issues with modern day Christianity, is that they just simply don't have the time to focus on that because they're focusing on arguing for, what the Bible says, and arguing for, like pushing for more people to believe in Jesus, and then not focusing on the actual walk of imitating Jesus.
That was very well said. And that is really how it's shaken out. And that's the big question. And we're all trying to address the elephant in the room. Those of us in the deconstruction space hear from the reformers, or from what has come from this Protestant Reformation, or, this, or maybe just in the 19th century, this demand for inerrancy and like just the fear of science. And, I'm not sure how this all got to where we are. How's my audio? Is that okay?
Oh yeah, it's good.
Okay. I thought I heard something. Okay. So the practicality of this faith and the kindness and the compassion and the love, that's what happened to me. I mean, I felt so fearful and afraid of the world and afraid of others. And I thought that so many people had it wrong. I was like, oh my gosh, you were listening to a Bethel song. How dare you? I was like, I had it, my right eye was twitching. I was so stressed out. I was just freaking out because everybody was doing everything wrong. And it's just awful. And that's where I was so grateful to have your time here, because the shackles, I don't know. I just wrote recently, I've been trying to put words to this experience. And they said, oh, you're on this Luciferian labyrinth in the New Age. Like, you have to charge your crystals, and you have to stretch, and you have to align your chakras. And now we're going to give you this. And I was like, you lied. That was just another spiritual hamster wheel you just put me on, of like perfection and put off, put on, and blah, 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 blah. And it was just like kind of wicked. And they lied to me. And I'm like, don't, the whole thing has been wild. So this conversation's been the opposite of wild. It's been comforting. It's been exciting. That intellectual humility, I want to swim in this place. Like, hello, thank you for being here and sharing some of your thoughts. Thank you for your courage of standing up for this, theological framework and articulating it in such a loving and compassionate way. I love spending time on your page. I love your videos. We didn't touch much on your parenting stuff, but you do talk a lot about that on your Instagram page, which I will link in the show notes. And I'm very grateful for that kind of approach you're taking, because obviously there's a lot of need for that. The more we're learning about child development, I have borderline personality disorder, and we're just learning so much about how we can provide children with more secure attachments, able to ask them more open-ended, child-friendly questions, and just really help their development along in a more friendly manner these days. And we didn't have this information 10 years ago, so that's okay. But now we do, so let's incorporate it. So thank you again for your time and being here, and thank you guys for listening. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right, stop recording. That's all I have for you today, folks. Thanks again for listening. And for future episodes, we've got some incredible interviews. We've got my friend Emma talking about equality and focus, reproductive rights, gender norms. We've got the interview with Neil Van Leeuwen, the author of Religion as Make-Believe. I'm so stoked for that chat. And then Conspiracy Chronicles, we'll be talking about ancient plots to modern mind games. We'll be talking with my girl Teresa and emotional freedom tapping, and a lot more interviews to come. So until then, maintain your curiosity, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a great week.